You think fear is just an emotion. In Rome, it was a currency. One flick of the emperor's wrist could bankrupt a man's courage, collapse a rebellion, or turn an entire city into loyal subjects. And nowhere was this power more visible than in the games. From the marble balcony of the emperor's box, the view was more than just the arena. It was the city itself, compressed into one screaming mass. Commodus understood this better than most. History paints him as a megalomaniac, a man who dressed as Hercules and fought gladiators himself. But his real genius, or sickness, was in how he wielded fear. Each match, each execution, each staged humiliation was part of a larger design, to remind Rome that all glory and survival flowed through him. This was panem et circenses, bread and circuses, but stripped of the soft illusion. Juvenal coined the phrase as an insult to a people who traded freedom for spectacle, but the emperors took it as a blueprint. By giving the mob free grain and violent theater, they pacified the masses while reinforcing the hierarchy. The games became a political machine. And here's the psychological core: humans adapt to fear, but only if it's predictable. Rome made it unpredictable. A champion could be rewarded with gold one day and fed to the beasts the next, based on nothing but imperial whim. This uncertainty activated what modern psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that keeps gamblers at slot machines. The crowd didn't just watch, they were conditioned. The possibility of reward kept them loyal, the threat of ruin kept them obedient. Imagine being a gladiator. You've survived 10 fights, maybe more. You can hear the crowd chanting your name. Then you glance up, and there's the emperor leaning forward, fingers poised. That tiny motion, the tilt of his thumb, is more terrifying than any blade. Because it's not just your life on the line. It's the reminder that your life was never yours to begin with. This fear didn't stop at the sand. Roman citizens learned the lesson too. Public executions were staged for maximum visibility. Criminals, political enemies, even Christians in the later centuries, all paraded into the arena to be broken in front of thousands. The message was simple: you exist because Rome allows it. The death was almost secondary. The real punishment was knowing that survival was granted, not earned. But fear alone can't hold a city. It corrodes, makes people reckless. That's why Rome paired fear with glory. A gladiator's victory could mean fame, freedom, or wealth, symbols that the emperor was generous as well as deadly. This duality created a paradox. The same ruler who could destroy you was also the one who could elevate you beyond your station. Psychologists call this approach avoidance conflict, the push and pull between desire and dread. It's addictive, and Rome exploited it without mercy. Modern governments and corporations still use this principle, though the arena looks different. Promotions paired with layoffs, social media praise paired with public shaming. The mechanisms haven't changed, only the stage. But in ancient Rome, it was raw, unfiltered. Every citizen could feel the emperor's reach, whether in the marketplace or in the roar of the Colosseum. By the end of the games, the crowd went home sated, not just with bread and wine, but with the unspoken understanding of their place. The gladiators limped away, alive for now but carrying the weight of uncertainty. And the emperor, he sat in his marble seat, knowing he had once again reminded the city who held the leash. Because in Rome, fear wasn't a side effect. It was the point. In Rome, the emperor didn't have to shout to be heard. He didn't have to brandish a sword or march in front of the legions. All he had to do was raise his hand, and the entire city leaned in to see where it would fall. The arena was more than blood sport. It was a public stage where loyalty could be measured in the roar of the crowd and the flicker of a gaze. Commodus knew this well. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, describes him stepping into the arena not as an observer, but as a performer, dressed in the skins of lions, wielding the club of Hercules. To the mob, this was spectacle. To Commodus, it was propaganda. Every strike of his blade was a reminder that he was not just ruler by law, but by sheer physical dominance. Titus, too, understood the theater of power. When the Colosseum opened under his reign, he filled it with 100 days of games so extravagant that the people spoke of nothing else. Exotic animals, staged naval battles, and mass executions, all carefully orchestrated to drown out the whispers of dissent. Bread and circuses weren't just distractions, they were loyalty tests. Who cheered the loudest? Who stayed silent? The emperor's eyes, or the eyes of his informants, caught it all. Psychologically, this was mastery of association. The games blurred the line between the emperor's will and the fate of those in the arena. Every life spared was his mercy. Every death was his justice. Over time, the crowd didn't just watch. They connected their very sense of safety and survival to the man in the imperial box. This is the power of symbolic conditioning. Repeat an experience enough times, and the symbol, in this case the emperor, becomes inseparable from the emotion it evokes. For the citizens of Rome, that emotion was a volatile mix of awe and fear. The emperor wasn't just a distant figure on coins and statues. He was the one whose gaze could turn a day of celebration into a day of mourning. And because these decisions were made publicly, the entire city internalized the lesson: your life, your honor, your family's standing, all of it existed at the pleasure of one man. The manipulation didn't end with the audience. The fighters themselves were drawn into the web. Imagine being a gladiator, standing in the blinding sunlight of the arena, knowing the emperor was watching. Your survival didn't depend solely on your skill or courage. It hinged on whether your performance pleased him. A quick fight might bore the crowd. A drawn-out one might anger him. Your opponent wasn't the only man you had to read. You had to read the emperor's mood. This is where controlled menace becomes a psychological weapon. Commodus was notorious for fighting against opponents armed with dulled weapons while he wielded sharpened steel. The outcome was never in doubt, but that was the point. Every victory reinforced his invincibility, and every fighter who faced him knew that their role wasn't to win, but to make him look like a god. The humiliation of standing before the crowd, forced into submission, was as much a punishment as death itself. Even the crowd's loyalty was layered. They were not simply cheering for the man, they were cheering for the hand that could grant life or take it away. In modern psychology, this is called authority anchoring, the human tendency to assign disproportionate power and credibility to figures who control high-stakes outcomes. In Rome, the stakes didn't get higher than the arena. The brilliance or cruelty of the emperor's invisible hand was that it worked in silence. There were no explicit threats, no edicts plastered across the city walls warning of punishment for disloyalty. The message was absorbed through repetition: watch, fear, obey. A nod could lift a man from the dust. A frown could feed him to the beasts. And because it happened in public, every citizen became a witness and a participant in the performance of imperial dominance. It was a slow kind of control, more potent than any single act of violence. Not a sword at the throat, but the constant awareness that the sword was there, always ready, always waiting for the hand to move. And the fighters, they learned a truth the crowd could only guess at. The games weren't designed for them to win. They were designed for them to serve. But the manipulation didn't stop with the crowd. It went deeper, into the minds of the fighters themselves. Before a gladiator ever set foot in the arena, his mind had already been shaped to fit its demands. The transformation began in the ludi, the gladiator training schools, where discipline was not a suggestion but a survival mechanism. Inscriptions from Pompeii still speak of the rules etched into these barracks. No fighting outside the arena, no questioning orders, no defying the lanista, the owner and trainer. Violate them, and the punishments were swift and public: whippings, chains, reduced rations. It wasn't just about teaching men to fight. It was about breaking down the instinct to resist. The lanista knew that an uncooperative fighter was dangerous, not to the enemy, but to the system. So training wasn't designed only to strengthen the body. It was designed to create obedience that bypassed conscious thought. This is where dark psychology found its most brutal expression. Gladiators lived in a cycle of punishment and reward so tight that hesitation became unthinkable. Fight well. You might get extra wine, better food, or a rare visit from a woman. Falter, question an order, or show defiance. The lash would answer before you could finish the thought. Over time, these cycles carved new pathways into the mind, reinforcing a single truth: your fate is not yours to decide. Modern psychologists call this learned helplessness, the state in which a person stops trying to escape suffering because past attempts have always failed. In the Ludi, the lesson was clear. No matter your skill, no matter your will, the system decides whether you live in comfort or in chains. That conditioning ensured that when the gates to the arena opened, the gladiator stepped forward without weighing his options. And yet, there was a paradox at play. The same system that broke a man's will to disobey also cultivated his will to fight. Gladiators were rewarded for aggression in the arena, but punished for it outside. They learned to channel their rage only when it served the spectacle, to hold it in like a blade kept sheathed until the exact moment it was needed. Even the barracks themselves were instruments of conditioning. The cells were cramped, the air heavy with the smell of sweat, leather, and metal. Every sound, the clank of chains, the thud of practiced swords, the barked orders of instructors, reminded the fighters that they lived inside a machine built for one purpose: to turn them into weapons for the crowd's entertainment. And it worked. The lanista could send a man into the sand with the confidence that he would obey, even if obedience meant certain death. The fighter might hate the system, he might dream of escape, but when the signal came, his body would move forward, not back. Years of conditioning had erased the hesitation. There were those who tried to rebel. Stories survive of gladiators who attacked their trainers or plotted escape. Most ended the same way, crucified outside the gates as a warning. Those who remained learned from the example. Resistance was not only futile, it was fatal. What makes this conditioning so chilling is that it didn't just prepare gladiators for the arena, it prepared them to accept their place in the hierarchy. The emperor might control the crowd, but the lanista controlled the fighters. And both understood the same truth: power doesn't require constant force. It only requires the certainty that force will come the moment you step out of line. And so, when the day of battle arrived, the gladiator didn't need to be told twice. The obedience was already there, etched into his body, branded into his mind. And the ultimate test of that conditioning happened not in the arena, but before the fight even began. The roar began long before the gates opened. It was not just noise, it was a wall of sound, pressing against the wooden doors like a living thing. Beyond it, the sand waited, bright under the sun. And between the two, the gladiator stood in the dim tunnel, breathing in the smell of dust, sweat, and the faint tang of iron. This moment was not improvised. It was ritual, as structured and deliberate as a religious ceremony. Ancient writers like Suetonius describe the spectacle that preceded the games: the music swelling from horns and drums, the chants rolling down from the stands, the surge of anticipation as the fighters emerged in ordered ranks. It was theater before blood. The march itself had a rhythm. Step by step, the gladiators advanced toward the center, their armor catching the light, their faces unreadable. And then the salute, mortuary T salutant. We who are about to die salute you. It was said to the emperor or the presiding official, but it was really for everyone. It was a public acknowledgement of fate, a stripping away of denial. From a psychological standpoint, this ritual was more than tradition. It was conditioning in motion. The march into the arena functioned as a liminal space, a threshold where fear was transformed into inevitability. The repetition of steps, the unison of voices, the weight of armor, all worked to narrow the mind's focus. The gladiator ceased to be a man with choices. He became part of the machine. Ritual also served as identity reinforcement. In the ludi, a gladiator learned that he was no longer just himself. He belonged to a class, a brotherhood defined by death. The ceremonial entrance reminded him, and everyone watching, of that identity. The crowd did not see Marcus or Lucius. They saw a secutor, a Retiarius, a Murmillo. The mask of the role was complete. There was a paradox here. The ritual's grandeur lent dignity to the condemned, but it also erased individuality. It gave the illusion of honor while binding the fighter more tightly to the system that would kill him. For the crowd, the entrance was a priming mechanism. The spectacle made them part of the ritual, complicit in what was about to happen. Applause and cheers acted as a form of collective consent. The bloodshed was now framed as performance, not slaughter. For the gladiator, it was a coping mechanism. By focusing on the steps, the salutes, the sound of the drums, he could push aside the thoughts that might paralyze him. The ritual reduced fear by narrowing it into a single accepted truth. The fight was inevitable. And as the last echoes of mortuary T salutant faded, the fighters took their places. The gates closed behind them. The sand was theirs for as long as they could hold it. Yet even this ritual was only the opening move in a much larger psychological game. Fear was not a side effect of the games. It was the point. When a Roman citizen walked into the Colosseum, they stepped into an arena designed not just for entertainment but for instruction. The lesson was simple. The state decides who lives and who dies, and it does so publicly. Executions were the most unflinching part of the day. Between the contests, condemned criminals, noxii, were brought into the arena with no weapons, often dressed in costumes mocking their crimes. Sometimes they were chained to posts and left for the beasts. Other times they were forced to reenact myths, where the death in the story ended with an actual death on the sand. Cassius Dio and Seneca both describe these scenes in chilling detail, an unarmed man playing Orpheus, torn apart by lions before he could finish his song. The audience understood the message. This wasn't random cruelty. It was the emperor's way of showing the outer limits of his mercy and the consequences of exhausting it. For the crowd, fear worked in layers. The first was direct horror, the smell of blood, the scream of the condemned, the thud of a body on sand. The second was recognition that could be me. It was a form of collective conditioning, reminding every Roman that their safety was conditional, granted only so long as they obeyed. Psychologists today call this terror management theory. The idea that our awareness of mortality shapes our behavior, often driving us toward loyalty to whatever system promises safety. In the Colosseum, the state itself was that system. The games showed that disobedience would not just cost your life. It would take your dignity, your identity, and your final moments. And the fighters felt this even more sharply. A gladiator might have glory, but he also knew his life could be ended for reasons beyond the sand, for a poorly timed gesture, for displeasing a sponsor, for crossing the wrong political line. The arena's dangers didn't end when the fight did. They extended into every interaction with the power above. The emperor's role was crucial. Sitting in the pulvinar, high above the action, he was both spectator and executioner. A simple tilt of his thumb could redeem or condemn. Ancient sources disagree on exactly how the thumbs up and thumbs down worked, but they agree on the psychological effect. The crowd's eyes shifted from the blood on the sand to the man in the box. In that moment, the emperor became the axis of life and death. The manipulation didn't stop with punishment. Public fear was fed by unpredictability. Executions weren't always announced in advance. Sometimes, a man entered the arena believing he was to fight a fair duel, only to find himself facing wild beasts or impossible odds. This uncertainty amplified the psychological pressure. If you never knew when the axe might fall, you learned to stay obedient at all times. Even outside the Colosseum, the games rippled through Roman life. News of a particularly brutal execution spread quickly through taverns, markets, and forums. Each retelling became another layer of state propaganda, a living reminder that Rome's justice was spectacular and absolute. But fear alone is a blunt instrument. History shows that when a population is ruled purely by terror, rebellion brews in the shadows. The emperors understood this. They knew that to keep the masses compliant without sparking revolt, fear had to be paired with something else. That something was hope. Hope that the condemned might win a last-minute pardon. Hope that a gladiator's skill could defy death. Hope that a man at the very bottom might, through courage or luck, rise in the public's esteem and win freedom. These slivers of possibility kept the audience engaged, leaning forward instead of turning away. The spectacle was not simply about death. It was about the tension between death and survival. Fear kept the people in line. Hope kept them coming back. But the real genius of the games was in how they mixed fear with hope. If fear was the iron chain, glory was the key that dangled just out of reach. For most gladiators, the odds of survival were already stacked against them. Yet in every ludus, whispers spread of men who had beaten those odds not just once, but enough times to earn their freedom. These stories were as much a part of the training as the drills and the sparring. They gave shape to an impossible dream to leave the arena not as a corpse, but as a man reborn. One name passed through the barracks like a sacred chant: Marcus Attilius. He entered the arena as a slave, an unknown man with no wealth, no pedigree. His first fight was against a veteran champion, the kind of opponent chosen to humiliate a newcomer. But Attilius won, and then he won again, and again. Enough victories, and the crowd began to chant his name. Rome loved nothing more than a man who could defy his fate under the emperor's gaze. Eventually, Attilius earned the rudes, a wooden sword that symbolized freedom. That sliver of possibility that, maybe, kept the fighters in line as much as any whip. Modern psychology calls this an intermittent reward schedule. You're not rewarded every time you fight. In fact, most days bring only pain, hunger, and exhaustion. But every now and then, there's a win. And that rare, unpredictable victory is more addictive than constant comfort could ever be. It plants a question in the mind: what if I'm next? Even the harshest punishments couldn't extinguish that thought. The prospect of glory transformed the arena from a death sentence into a gamble. And gamblers, as Rome's elite well knew, are the easiest people to keep at the table. The public fed this addiction too. The roar of the crowd, the laurel wreaths, the coins tossed into the sand, they made victory feel like destiny, even when it was just survival. Gladiators who rose in fame were showered with gifts, women's attention, and the fleeting illusion of power. All of it was fragile, but in a life measured in days, even fragile power was intoxicating. For the emperors, this hope was a political tool as sharp as any sword. It kept the fighters striving instead of rebelling, chasing the mirage instead of challenging the system that built it. It gave the crowd something to root for, a reason to cheer instead of question. And most importantly, it bound both groups to the games, ensuring the spectacle never lost its grip. Because when a man believes that his next fight might be the one that changes everything, he will endure almost anything to reach it. And when fear and hope mix, loyalty becomes unbreakable. Before a man could fight in the arena, he had to speak the words that would bind him more tightly than any chain. It was called the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, the gladiator's oath. Not whispered in private, not signed in ink, but spoken aloud before witnesses, often in the very shadow of the arena walls. The Latin is preserved in fragments of contracts and legal texts, Juri, vincere, verberare, feroc necari. I will endure burning, binding, beating, and death by the sword. The order of the words mattered. First came the fire, then the rope, then the whip, and finally the steel. It was a list of possible ends, recited as a pledge to accept them all. No promise of victory, no promise of mercy, just the acceptance of pain as destiny. Rome took this oath seriously. To break it was not just cowardice, it was sacrilege. The sacramentum was more than a legal formality, it was a sacred act. In Rome's eyes, a man who spoke those words had already died once in spirit and been reborn as a weapon for the games. In practice, the ceremony varied. Some were made to kneel. Others swore while standing on the blood-stained sand, staring at the emperor's box. There are accounts, though debated, of initiates touching a sword to their chest as they spoke, pressing until blood welled up, sealing the vow in their own flesh. Psychologically, the power of the oath was immense. Once spoken, it became an anchor. Modern military psychologists recognize something similar in the rituals of elite units. When a soldier swears to serve unto death, it changes how they view risk, fear, and pain. In that moment, the self begins to dissolve into the identity of the group. You are no longer a man who might die. You are a man who has already accepted death. The same is true in gangs, where initiation rites, often violent, serve as an unspoken contract. You endure pain for the group, and in return the group claims you as one of their own. That shared suffering becomes proof of belonging. The gladiators understood this instinctively. A man who had taken the oath beside you was no longer just another fighter. He was bound to the same fate, the same fire, the same end. And this was the genius of Rome's control. The sacramentum didn't just bind gladiators to the arena, it bound them to each other. That bond was worth more than chains. A man might try to escape a master, but few would betray a brother who had bled under the same vow. Of course, not every oath was truly voluntary. Many gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals. For them, the sacramentum was not a choice but a performance, a public submission to a system that had already decided their fate. And yet, even for these men, the act of swearing had an effect. Repetition, ritual, and public commitment are powerful tools of conditioning. Say the words often enough and the mind begins to believe them. In the end, the oath became a second skin. For some, it was a source of pride, a declaration that they would not flinch from death. For others, it was a curse, a reminder that their life no longer belonged to them. Either way, once the words were spoken, there was no turning back. But not all oaths were given by choice, some were forged in chains. Not every man who stepped into the arena came in chains. Some walked in willingly, or so it seemed. These were the auctorati, free citizens who sold themselves into the life of a gladiator. On paper, they had a choice. They signed contracts, took the sacramentum, and accepted the same brutal training as any slave. The reward was usually a large signing bonus, enough to erase debts, feed a family, or escape poverty. In rare cases, it was the lure of fame. Rome held these men up as proof that the arena wasn't only for the condemned. Look, the message went, even free men choose this path. It was propaganda disguised as personal ambition. But in reality, the choice was shaped by desperation. Most auctorati were drowning in debt, shamed by scandal, or stripped of other opportunities. Signing away their freedom was less a bold gamble than a final escape from a life already cornered. The law even forbade senators and equestrians from becoming gladiators, not to protect them from danger, but to protect the illusion. The games had to appear as a place where the desperate, not the dignified, went to prove themselves. In contrast stood the damnati ad ludum, the condemned criminals and prisoners of war. They had no contracts to sign, no money to gain. For them, the arena was simply the last stop on a one-way road. Many were given the same training as auctorati, but with an unspoken difference. They were not expected to survive long enough to see freedom. And yet, the psychological effect on both groups could be strangely similar. Seneca wrote of gladiators who found freedom in slavery, men who, once stripped of every other choice, discovered a kind of peace in knowing their path was fixed. Modern psychology calls this perceived autonomy, the belief that you are still steering your fate, even when the road is already chosen for you. The auctorati believed they had chosen glory. The condemned sometimes convinced themselves they had chosen to face death with honor. Rome was a master at feeding this illusion. The contracts, the oaths, the ceremonial salutes, all reinforced the idea that the fighters were participants, not victims. And the brilliance or cruelty of this system was that the illusion of choice didn't just control the fighters. It shaped the crowd as well. When a man fights believing he chose to be there, the audience feels no pity. They cheer his bravery, not his suffering. The games could be sold as sport, not slaughter, but the truth was always darker. Whether written in ink or forced in chains, every path to the arena ended the same way, with the sand underfoot, the crowd roaring above, and the emperor's will hanging over all. And that illusion of choice extended far beyond the fighters into the crowd itself. The gladiators fought in the sand, but the real transformation happened in the marble seats above. At the start of the day, the audience could arrive as individuals, bakers, merchants, mothers with children. Many came out of curiosity or to enjoy the rare luxury of a free spectacle, funded by the state. They might greet neighbors, share bread, and talk idly about politics or the weather. But once the trumpets sounded, something in the air shifted. Tacitus, the sharp-eyed historian, saw it as a sign of moral decay. The shows turned men into something less than men. He wasn't speaking of the gladiators, he was speaking of the crowd. The transformation began subtly. A murmur rippled when a sword struck shield, gasps and cheers when a fighter stumbled, and then, inevitably, the first cry for blood, jugula, kill him. The voice was just one among thousands, but it didn't remain alone for long. This is deindividuation, the psychological phenomenon where individual identity dissolves in the presence of a crowd. You stop feeling like you and start feeling like part of us. Personal responsibility fades. Actions you would never take alone become not only possible, but thrilling. In Rome, the amphitheater was engineered to amplify this effect. The oval shape made sound roll like a wave, enveloping every spectator in the roar of the masses. The emperor's presence, visible in his elevated box, gave the violence a stamp of legitimacy. When the most powerful man in the empire could decide life or death with a flick of his thumb, who in the crowd could question their own cries for the same? Soon, empathy was replaced by a different hunger. Fighters became less like men and more like pieces in a game. The crowd's mood could swing wildly, one moment chanting for mercy, the next demanding execution. It wasn't hypocrisy. It was the intoxicating sense of control, the belief that their voices shaped fate. Psychologists call this mob mentality, the surrender of personal moral judgment to the emotional current of the group. In the arena, It was heightened by ritual and repetition. Spectators learned when to cheer, when to jeer, and when to chant in unison. Even the children learned the signals, their innocence shaped by the same rhythms of violence. And here's the darkest truth: the games didn't just reflect the people's desires, they reshaped them. A citizen who had never seen a man die could leave the Colosseum eager for the next death. Compassion eroded with each spectacle until cruelty felt natural, even noble, when done in the name of Rome. The games trained the crowd as surely as the ludi trained the gladiators. Fighters learned to obey. Spectators learned to hunger, and both became tools in the hands of those who ruled. Tacitus warned that such entertainments distracted citizens from tyranny, numbing them to corruption and decay. The people, believing themselves entertained, were in fact being conquered not by force, but by their own appetites. The Colosseum was a battlefield, but the crowd was the true combatant, fighting not for survival, but for the thrill of power without consequence. And that was the genius of Rome's design. The games didn't merely kill men in the arena. They forged a citizenry that accepted, even celebrated, blood as the price of empire. Which is why, in the end, the games were never just about the gladiators. The Colosseum stands in ruins now, its stone skeleton a relic of an empire long gone. The sand is gone, the gates rusted shut, the voices of gladiators silenced for nearly 2 millennia. And yet, the arena never truly closed. It simply changed its shape. Juvenal, the satirist who lived in Rome's 1st century, left behind a warning so sharp it still cuts today. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Feed the people and distract them, and they will stop caring who holds the reins of power. It was the emperor's formula for control then, and in different clothing, it works just as well now. You no longer gather in stone amphitheaters to watch men kill each other. Instead, you fill stadiums, scroll endlessly on glowing screens, or pack into rally halls. The weapons have changed, swords replaced by microphones, shields by camera lenses, but the psychology is the same. The spectacle remains the stage where power is performed and loyalty is tested. Consider the modern political rally. The leader stands elevated, framed by symbols of authority, the crowd below chanting in unison. It is the emperor's box reborn, the tilt of the hand replaced by the rise of the voice, the roar of the crowd shaping the performance as much as the performer shapes the crowd. You might think you are watching. In truth, you are participating. Every cheer, every sign waved, every moment of collective emotion is a vote of loyalty, recorded not in law but in psychology. Or take the sports arena. The rules of the game, the colors of the teams, the choreography of the crowd, all designed to turn strangers into allies and rivals into enemies. The players may not fight to the death, but the emotional investment can be just as consuming. Triumph feels personal, defeat a kind of wound. And like in Rome, the spectacle becomes a safe outlet for aggression, or a convenient distraction from everything outside the stadium walls. Then there is the media, the endless feed of conflict, outrage, and entertainment that floods daily life. Each headline, each viral clip is a miniature spectacle, engineered to provoke reaction. Anger, fear, pride, pity, the cycle repeats until the emotions themselves become addictive. It is no accident. Algorithms and editors alike know what Rome's emperors knew. If you can keep people looking at the show, you can decide what they don't see. The tools of control haven't changed, only the stage. Ritual still binds people to identity. Fear still sharpens loyalty. Hope still keeps the game alive. And the illusion of choice still convinces us that participation is freedom. But here is the uncomfortable truth: the crowd was never just a victim. In Rome, The people demanded the games as much as the emperors supplied them. In modern life, the appetite for spectacle remains ours to feed or starve. We click, we buy tickets, we chant, we post. We watch the thumbs rise and fall, digital now, but just as decisive, and feel the thrill of being part of something larger. That is why the arena endures. It does not need walls of stone. It lives in the moments when individuality dissolves into collective will, when emotion drowns reason, when performance replaces reality. The actors change, but the script is eternal. So the question is not whether the arena still exists. It is whether you recognize when you are inside it. Can you feel the pull of the crowd's roar? Can you tell when the game is shaping your thoughts instead of the other way around? Rome's citizens rarely asked themselves these questions, and so they cheered their way into complacency. But you are not bound to repeat their fate. The first step is to see the patterns, to notice the rituals, the fear, the hope, the illusions. To remember Juvenal's warning, not as ancient cynicism, but as present reality. Because bread and circuses were never just about Rome. They are about power itself, and the ways it hides in plain sight. Because once you recognize the game, you can decide whether to play it.